Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming here. My name is Dr. Sam Shea. I'm a doctorate in chiropractic. I'm also a certified practitioner for the Institute for Functional Medicine and also with the Kalish Institute for Functional Medicine. And today I want to talk to you about identifying the ideal diet for your brain. I got involved in this long, circuitous journey. I've been on tons of podcasts and I have about 100 videos on my YouTube channel. If you want to hear the long version, it's all there. Based common story, very sick as a child, tried various different routes, and the medical route didn't work for me in my case, but then I got involved with natural medicine when I was 16 with Dr. Jensen's Guide to Better Bowel Care, of all books. And despite both my parents being medical doctors and my grandfather being a medical doctor, I was supposed to be the third generation. I turned a hard left turn into natural medicine. And specifically, I got very interested in the brain, particularly when I was studying functional neurology when I was in chiropractic school. And my focus has been primarily on the brain, because when you look at all the lifestyle interventions that everyone's going to be recommending, everyone's going to be talking about, and all the different things that people do in natural medicine, you can, in a meaningful way, orbit it around brain health, because all the best diets, lifestyle, sleep, avoiding infections, avoiding toxins, good routine, stress reduction, all these different things, exercise, posture, hormones, they can be pointed directly to the brain. And there's one particular piece of the brain that people constantly struggle with. I know I struggle with, and this is identifying what is your ideal diet. Is it vegan? Is it paleo? Is it high carb? Is it Mediterranean? Is it South Beach? Is it North Beach? Is it West Beach? Is it East Beach? Is it no beach? Whatever your beach is it what diet is for you? Because I'm sure if you're on this call, if you're on this presentation, that you have tried, I don't know, 12, a baker's dozen diets or so, and you've seen it work, air quotes, for some other person or a group of people. You've read a inspiring, blog post, heard a podcast, saw a show, whatever it was, read a book, and you may have tried it and it worked in some capacity, but then you either hit a plateau or had invariable results, or whatever your goal was, whether it was less foggy brain, losing weight, better sleep, better shape, any type of metabolic disease prevention. It didn't kind of meet up to the standards that you were hoping for. And I certainly went through this giant struggle myself. And personally, I am dealing with the realities of what happens when people do not have an ideal diet dialed in. For example, my father right now, he's dealing with the mid-ish stages of dementia. And this is a person who has an MD, a PhD, wrote 2 books, has a MacArthur Genius Award to his name, and he can't remember what day it is. And what's another term for neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia is type 3 diabetes. Then there's all the money that's lost from people trying all these fad diets, taking, even using supplements that are not catered to them, all the unnecessary health bills. And of course, if you're thinking long-term, the consequences of long-term healthcare if you don't have your diet dialed in. Then if health or finances isn't of concern to you, then what about time? Well, this research on distraction science, which is an actual thing, is that for every distraction that you endure, whether it's a text or a phone call or an interruption, or thinking about food, or dare I say foraging for food, and foraging these days involves walking over to the fridge and checking it, because clearly the contents of the fridge changed in the past 20 minutes when you checked it before. Each of those distractions takes on average 23 minutes and 15 seconds to recalibrate your attention back fully to whatever you were doing before you were foraging. So if you forage for food as a distraction, even twice a day for say 2 minutes or so, and then you add on the 23 minutes and 15 seconds on top of that, that's a total of, per time, that's a total of 50 minutes per day. So if you want to have 5 extra years of healthy life, save $50,000, when you stretch it out over the amount of decades you plan on living, in terms of saving money on unnecessary diets, fad diets, and all the rest of it, prevention, etc. And if you want to reclaim 50 minutes of your day, productive time of your day, without being distracted by the thoughts of food or foraging for food, then knowing how to get to your ideal diet is really critical. So there are 5 layers to figuring out your ideal diet. The foundational layer is genetics. That's the layer most people miss. That's the one that's most confusing. That's the one that's most controversial. Everyone's taking their stake in the, actually may not be the most controversial, but it's getting up there in the ranks. Everyone's staking their claim on genetics. And my perspective is that if you know your genetics as a foundation properly, particularly things like carb tolerance, like what is your carb tolerance? Are you a keto, paleo, Mediterranean, or high carb? You'll notice I didn't say vegan, vegetarian, or carnivore. I'm talking about ratios of carbohydrates relative to proteins and fats. If you know your carb tolerance, that sets you up to win for the entire rest of your life. Additionally, with genetics, you can figure out things like your genetic relationship to lactose, gluten, histamines. That's a secret one. When people have or they're reactive to histamines, they can kind of secretly swell with fluid because they're reactive to certain foods. Just to make this real, when someone's stung by a bee, the bee doesn't inject a half quart of water into your arm when it swells up. What happens is that the body floods the area with water to do what? Dilute the venom from eroding and corroding your tissues. That's the point of histamine, is to flood the area in order to prevent, to dilute toxic venomous chemicals. Now, that's locally to the arm, but if you are genetically vulnerable to histamine and you're eating foods that you're reacting to, that swelling kind of goes systemic and you kind of have this washed out look no matter how much you exercise. The other thing you can look at with genetics is your vulnerability to caffeine, to coffee. Now, I know it's early here in the Pacific and Mountain Time, so I don't mean to ruin anyone's breakfast too much, but there's certain percentage of people, I being one of them, where I get what's called, quote, caffeine-induced anxiety and depression. I will say that again, caffeine-induced anxiety and depression. Now, I know we have an author here who says, what if it's not depression? Well, this is one of those variables that people need to get genetically tested about, because the anxiety provoked by genetic vulnerability to caffeine can be interpreted incorrectly as, oh, I'm getting the buzz of coffee, I'm going to get stuff done. No, you're just an anxious mess. Or I'm talking, not you, me. That's me. It didn't matter how much coconut oil or special MCT extract or cinnamon or whatever else is going into making it whatever proof coffee you want. I was kidding myself until I got my genes back. I was like, oh, okay. It was really anxiety. So for me, my life completely changed when I got my genetics back and I realized that I was reactive to coffee. So too with discovering my genetics on my carb tolerance. I had the most Portlandia Mediterranean diet ever. I knew the names of my farmers, some of their chickens. Like the quinoa was grown by left-handed monks and harvested on the last full moon, sung in lotus. I'm kidding, sort of. And it didn't matter. It wasn't a quality issue of carbs. It was a quantity issue. Now, what was the issues I was dealing with? Now, I was living in New Zealand at the time, and I was lecturing on nutrition, and I've been speaking on nutrition, and I'm up there feeling really not congruent because I'm having terrible digestive issues that aren't going away. I mean, I had digestive issues so bad that I would, my presence, what was released would kill flies, melt paint, and empty yoga rooms. So my digestive problems were really bothering me for over 20 years. And when I got my genes back, I discovered I had the second lowest carb tolerance you can have, equivalent to that of an Inuit, which blew my mind. And within 1 week of changing my diet to match my genetic capacity for carbs, my digestive problems of 20 years went away in 1 week because I had gone to my genetic baseline. Now, I happen to be a low carb person, but there are high carb people and there are people in between. This is where genetic variation individuality comes in. There is no one proper diet, even at the genetic level. It just doesn't exist. There's at least 4 major categories with several shades of gray in between. Now, that's the first layer, the one people mostly miss. The second layer, pardon me, the second layer is therapeutic. So this is where functional medicine comes in. So therapeutic layer is, do you have anything meaningful going on that has to be addressed? So for example, if someone is a low carb, high fat diet, but they have problems with their gallbladder, their carnitine shuttle and or their mitochondria are damaged, so they can't properly process fats, or they've got problems with fat absorption, or their pancreatic lipase isn't working. If they eat fat, they won't feel good because of a therapeutic layer that's not addressed. But if they eat less high fat, they won't feel good because it's not matching their genetics. So they're kind of caught in between. So that's the therapeutic layer that we have to address. Now, the inverse of that, if someone is better suited for a high carb diet, but they have a hidden gut infection like, I don't know, candida, if you feed that carbs, they're going to feel bad. But if you eat low carbs, you're also going to feel bad. So this is where people can get caught in this ping pong of diets that all make sense on paper, but do not work for you individually. Now, the goal is to get to your genetic foundation and reap the benefits of that. But if there's a therapeutic layer on top of that that needs to be addressed, needs to be addressed. The third layer on top of that is personal preference. So personal preference is what it sounds like, what you grew up with, what your favorite foods are. There's massive cultural implications. For example, many cultures around the world eat insects. Many people in other parts of the world don't. In the West, the only insects we really eat would be, honestly, shrimp. They're kind of insects of the sea. That maybe cricket powder kind of made some inroads a little bit, and who knows where that is at the moment. But personal preference really matters, because even if you know your perfectly healthy diet, but you really don't want to eat it, that's a problem. Now, there's other genetic factors as well that can go into personal preference, like your genetic sensitivity to the taste of bitter or to the taste of sweetness. So if someone's a, quote, super taster of bitter foods, they will avoid, consciously or subconsciously, cruciferous vegetables and other bitter leafy greens, but they will also avoid things like beer and red wine. So there's, in all things, trade-offs. Bitter is genetically determining bitter, genetically determining sugar preference. If you know those, then you can change your culinary environment. So if you are a super taster for bitter and you have been avoiding broccoli and you find out you are a super taster, I'm not telling you to hold your nose and here comes the plane, just like what happens to you when you're 5 years old. I'm not saying that. There's 4 specific ways to mask the flavor of bitter in your cooking. It's easier to change your environment than your willpower. Ask any 5-year-old you're trying to force feed a Brussels sprout. So that's the preference layer. Then there's access. That's the 4th layer. Access is kind of the hard realities of, do you have the time? Are you in a food desert? Do you go to the farmer's market? Is there a farmer's market? Is there really good vendors at a farmer's market? Do you have financial capacity to access the foods that match your genetics, therapeutic levels, and preference levels? There's an access issue, and also people who travel or who don't have a lot of time because they're dealing with, whether it's a business or they're caring for an aging relative, or they've got a lot of kids, or whatever the circumstance may be. Access is the 4th layer that we have to really take into account and modify to people's daily reality. And then the 5th and final layer is earth. Earth is where your genetics, therapeutic preference, and access meets everyone around you and the broader society and the environment at large. So for example, people, they choose to eat based on certain politics, environments, carbon footprint, etc. I, for example, avoid almonds because they use, every pound of almond is 1,900 gallons of water. 1,900 gallons. So that's relative to many other agricultural crops, which is way less. So that's one example of earth. And that's, again, the intersection of where your health, your preference, your access intersects with the world around you. So those are the 5 layers to interpret diet, and they can change, particularly the genetics layer doesn't change. But the therapeutic layer does change. It changes with age, it changes with health status, changes with shifting in environment. Personal preferences can definitely change over time, those that are not genetically based. Access certainly changes if you move or if something happens in the region, or if we're dealing with global supply chain issues right now, access is an issue for certain food items. Or if there's like a major run on a certain vegetable. I remember there was a certain book that was released talking about celery juice, which shall remain unnamed. And there's literally a scarcity of celery across Colorado for like 2 months or something nutty. And then there's Earth, which is your understanding of how politics, environment, etc. go on. So those are the 5 layers of how to determine your unique diet. Any questions?
Sam, there's some questions in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of those questions is, where do people get genetically tested?
So they get genetically. So this is not a genetic test that's a 23andMe. The carb tolerance one is not one that's a 23andMe or Ancestry, because it's not a variation analysis. It's not looking, are you all, just to be a bit nerdy for people listening in, it's not if you're a homozygous or heterozygous, a variant. It's looking at copy numbers, which is a 3-dimensionality genetics people don't talk about or mostly don't understand. And what that means is that mostly people are looking for variants. Are you have a good copy, a medium copy, or a bad copy? It's like, are you good witch or a bad witch? It's instead, we're looking at the number of duplicates of a gene. So I'm looking at a particular gene that controls the enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates. So if I have 2 copies of this gene, I secrete 2x amount of this enzyme to break down carbohydrates. But if I have 15 copies, then I have 15x. So it's like the number of cannons you have. Each cannon spits out a certain rate of this enzyme. So it's not the variation of the cannon doesn't matter. It's actually the number of cannons that really matter. So this test is not a normal one that you would get through 23andMe or Ancestry. It's a completely separate analysis. If people are interested, it's one of the few people here in the country that actually run this test. If they're interested, they can connect to me and even get my ebook on genetics, and they can schedule a chat with me. They can go to my website, drsamshea.com, and schedule a 15-minute chat. So it's not a normal company. There's very few of us that actually run it.
And can you put your contact info in the chat for us if anybody
Sure.
wants to reach out, talk to you further?
Okay, so I'm putting in, that's the ebook, the genetics /next is the ebook. Then I also do, if people are, this is a non sequitur, but I also do stand-up comedy as a hobby. I'm also putting a link to my stand-up comedy clips in the chat. Very important, super important, most important. And I'm doing comedy as an aside. I'm building up in our special part of it, a lot of Boulder jokes. If people are in Colorado and they want to make fun of jokes about Boulder, there's plenty in there. But I also want to teach about what it's like to have Asperger's and overcome addiction. I've overcome sugar addiction and video game addiction. I'm also on the spectrum. So I use humor as a Trojan horse for truth to be able to explain to people what it's like. Because if someone sat with me 15 minutes, 25 years ago and said, hey, you're not neurotypical, this is what that means, that would have saved me 20 years of grief. So I have my details in there, drsamshea.com. Are there any other questions, Amelia, that coming through? Any other questions? If people have any others, does the panel have any questions for me?
There was a comment in the chat about after you mentioned how much water goes into producing almonds, about how much water actually goes into producing beef as well.
My question is which beef, because I get all pasture fed, all pasture finished beef that's local. And there's a big difference between big agro, which I think is thoroughly abhorrent and disgusting and terrible. And when I would lecture on diet, I had one talk called Ending the Food War, Finding Peace and Common Ground Between Vegans and Paleos. And the punchline is that everyone agrees with 95% of everything: local, clean, organic, friendly practices, all like all these things. And there's a disagreement on whether it should be broccoli or beef. And my challenge to the people that are vegans and vegetarians is, okay, your responsibility is dealing with the harsh and dangerous realities of the GMO industry. And it's the meat eater's responsibility to deal with the harsh realities of big cattle and like the horrible things that go on with that. So it's like, if we can both agree to handle our respective sides, then we can stop fighting with each other and start mutually supporting with each other. That was my response to, it was a tent of 400 people, half of which we identified as vegans. So, and everyone agreed with that. So my response is which beef, not if it's agro beef for sure. But pasture, I have disagreements. Also, I can't be vegan. I tried and I almost wasted away. And people can say, oh, you didn't do it right and all the rest. No, I did it right and I was wasting away. Sorry. And I know people, we all know people actually in the community we share. We all know people who were vegan superstars, teaching, writing books, who stopped being vegan for health reasons. So it's not an absolutism. And that's why I really love testing, because you can figure out what you actually need. And if you are vegan, then for God's sake, get tested, not only for carb tolerance, but also check things like your amino acid profile, your fatty acid profile. Like if you just get checked, see what, dude, same thing goes for paleos. Same thing goes for carnivores. Same thing goes for everybody. Get your nutrition levels checked.
Someone is asking you to review the 5 carb tolerances again.
So the carb tolerance, the five layers are genetics, therapeutic, personal preference, access, earth. There's different types. The carb tolerance itself is nested underneath genetics. And there's 4 major categories of carb tolerance: keto, paleo, Mediterranean, high carb. And there's shades of gray within those. So like there's the higher carb Mediterranean, then there's a lower carb Mediterranean, and there's actually 2 other stages in between that. And there's different stages of carb tolerance for paleo.
Dr. Sam, somebody had a question, Beverly. I have migraines almost every day and I'm allergic to all the medications my doctor has prescribed. Will genetic testing help me? So
the honest answer is nobody knows if it's going to help the migraines specifically, because there's all sorts of things that converge on migraines. What my understanding of migraines, and of course we have a migraine expert on the call, my understanding of migraines is that one of the main mechanisms, it's the dilation of the cerebral vasculature, that you have pain fibers wrapping around the major blood vessels of the brain, and that they dilate when there's not enough nutrition going to the brain in that particular area. And blood vessels have only one cell lining in between, so they can dilate to a point before they rip. That's called a stroke. And so there's pain fibers wrapped around the vasculature to, when it starts to dilate too much, getting into the danger zone, you get a massive pain signal. And what do you do when you have a massive migraine? You close your eyes, you don't talk, you don't move, and you plug your ears, because that way you're reducing the amount of stimuli into your brain, decreasing the need for nutrition in that part of the brain, therefore decreasing the need to have the vessels dilate to provide said nutrition. So there's all sorts of triggers, thousands of triggers that go into that. Genetics, the way that I could weave a thread through how genetics would help is that if you are eating things that you are reacting to, whether it's histamines or other food allergens, or you're genetically you're eating in a way that's off your carb tolerance, which can affect your blood sugar, all of those different variables are some of many different variables that would intersect on the brain and migraines rather.
Thank you so much. And Jocelyn, did I say that right? Has a question. Is your genetic testing similar to the DNA company?
No, because they don't do copy number analysis. There's the DNA company does variation analysis. I also do that, but this specific one on carb tolerance is not about checking for variations. It's checking for duplicates of the gene. The reason why I say this is the 3-dimensionality on genetics is that it's It's looking at the numbers of, like, you can have genes aren't lined up like a keyboard that you just kind of strum it or play. It's like one variant, one variant, one variant, one variant. Actually, you can have multiple of the same notes all tied together. So it's a different type of analysis, and the DNA company, to my knowledge, doesn't do that.
Thank you. And for those of you who are asking, sorry if I don't remember the lady who asked about migraines, Dr. Amelia, if you don't see it in the chat, responded. And I know Dr. Amelia is going to be talking about migraines coming up. So stay tuned. Thank you so much, Dr. Sam. This is amazing. I know you need to hop on a plane to go give a talk.
Hang around. Yeah, I can hang around for another like five or so minutes to answer questions in the chat. But yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. Really, really appreciate it. I'll get and put my details in the chat, drsamshay.com. And then if you want my ebook on genetics, you can just do /genetics. And thank you again for putting all this on. It's a real honor to be here.
Oh, it's totally our pleasure. Thank you so much for being our guest expert this time around on Brain Reboot 2022 2.0.